wind, when it blew through this little town in New Mexico, did not whisper secrets. It rasped, dry and weary, like an old man clearing his throat. It carried the taste of pulverized rock and something else, something ancient and ineffable, a spirit scent of iron and ash. This was not just a town. It was a memory in the making, fading slowly, like a sun-bleached photograph left on a dashboard. Its mines, the very arteries that once pumped life into its meager heart, had long since caved in, rusted shut, leaving nothing but gaping, forgotten wounds in the earth. Now the dust, fine and insidious, was the only constant, settling over everything like a shroud, finding its way into every cracked pane of glass, every peeling paint chip on the clapboard houses, every wrinkle on the faces of the few souls stubborn enough to remain. Nights here were particularly heavy, the air thick with the smell of corroded metal, a distant, weightless ash, and the kind of profound silence that was not just an absence of sound, but an entity in itself, waiting, listening. Martin Clay, 40 years old and wearing the kind of quiet solitude that was tailored just for him, had arrived in this forgotten pocket of the desert seeking precisely that: silence. Not just the absence of noise, but a deep, encompassing forgetfulness. His hands, still calloused and scarred, remembered the cold bite of wrenches, the greasy comfort of engine blocks, the precise dance of gears and pistons. His eyes, though, had a different memory etched into them, a faded, tired hue born from the slow, agonizing death of his marriage back in Albuquerque. He had packed his life into a beat-up pickup truck that had seen better decades, and driven until the landscape flattened into an endless tableau of scrub brush and red rock, until the roar of the city became a faint, irrelevant hum in his rearview mirror. He craved the anonymity, the chance to simply exist, unburdened by the echoes of a life that had fractured into 1,000 sharp pieces. This desolate spot, a town so small it was a collection of dust-covered hopes more than a living community, promised that oblivion. He rented a small, one-story house on the western edge of town, closer to the raw, untamed desert than to the cracked asphalt of Main Street. It had a porch that sagged like an old man's shoulders and a yard that was mostly hard-baked dirt, but it faced the rising sun, and for Martin, that was enough. He spent his days in the garage he had bought, a decrepit corrugated metal structure that smelled of oil and old tires, slowly bringing it back to life, cleaning tools, organizing parts. The rhythmic clang of metal, the sharp scent of solvent, the satisfying click of a well-oiled ratchet. These were the familiar comforts that stitched his fractured world back together, one small, precise movement at a time. He considered it a good life, a simple life, a quiet life. Then there was the neighbor. He lived on the very edge of town, at the foot of a low, dry hill that rose like a hump-backed beast from the desert floor, covered in a prickly skin of creosote bushes and brittle mesquite. Martin had noticed the house first because of its windows. They were always, without exception, draped in heavy, dark curtains, thick enough to block out even the most intrusive New Mexico sunshine. No one, not even the old-timers who were born knowing everyone's business, had ever seen the man in the light of day. He was a shadow, a whisper, a figure of speculation. The locals, a sparse collection of ranchers, retirees, and the stubbornly unemployed, were a tight-lipped bunch, their faces weathered by sun and hardship. They avoided speaking of the neighbor, their conversations drying up faster than a desert spring whenever his house was mentioned. But their glances, quick and furtive, and their whispers, dry as tumbleweeds skittering across the cracked pavement, carried the same unspoken message. He's not one of us, an outsider with bad blood. He brought trouble here. The words, when they came, were steeped in the kind of old, ingrained sorrow that settles deep in the bones of a place, an ancient ache that predated even the mines. They spoke of things Martin, a man of logic and mechanics, had long dismissed as the superstitious ramblings of isolated folk. He had scoffed internally, attributing their unease to small-town paranoia, a fear of anything that deviated from the established monotonous rhythm of their days. Everyone needed an other to point fingers at, a scapegoat for the creeping sense of decay that was slowly suffocating their home. But that was before the first night. It was close to midnight, the kind of velvety black that only the deep desert knows, when the moon, a sliver of bone-white light, was still hiding behind the eastern hills. Martin had been lying in his bed, listening to the cicadas sawing their endless dry song, a sound that usually lulled him into a shallow sleep. Then it came, a howl. It was not the yip and yowl of a coyote, familiar and comforting in its wildness. This was different. It was long drawn out, a sound that tore at the fabric of the night itself. It was guttural, raw, yet imbued with a profound, unbearable sorrow, too deep, too full of a suffering that was too complex, too articulated to belong to any beast. It was impossibly too human. It rose and fell, a piercing blade of sound that sliced through the absolute stillness, vibrating in the very air around him, making the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. He sat bolt upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The air in the small bedroom suddenly felt thick, oppressive. An invisible weight pressed down on him, squeezing the oxygen from his lungs. His mouth was desert dry, a sudden, inexplicable thirst blooming in his throat. He swung his feet to the floor, the rough wood cool beneath his soles, and moved, compelled by an unseen force, to the window. He peered out into the impenetrable darkness, his breath catching in his throat. Nothing. Just the vast, inky blackness of the desert, stretching out towards the low, shrub-covered hill where the neighbor's house sat, a darker shadow against the dark. But he felt it. He felt the vibration, the lingering echo of that sound, reverberating through the earth itself. Something ancient, something inexplicable had stirred out there, and for the first time in a long time, Martin felt a primal, visceral fear that had nothing to do with broken hearts or failed careers. His lungs felt compressed, an invisible hand squeezed them, reminding him of the fragile, temporary nature of his breath. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat by the window, clutching a heavy wrench he had instinctively grabbed from his toolbox, listening to the silence that had returned, now deeper, more menacing than before. He watched the eastern sky slowly lighten, pushing back the oppressive darkness inch by agonizing inch until the sun, a fiery disk, finally broke free, painting the red rocks in hues of crimson and gold. When morning finally broke, the light felt thin, weak, unable to fully dispel the shadows that still clung to the corners of the town. The air was heavy, sticky. The night's strange occurrence left a physical residue. There was a faint, metallic tang, like static electricity before a storm, a distinct smell of ozone mixed with something else, something pungent, meaty, animalistic, like dried blood and unwashed fur. It was subtle, imperceptible, but once Martin noticed it, it clung to the back of his throat, a sickly sweet reminder of the previous night's horror. The silence that had once defined this little town now was less like an absence of sound and more like an absorption of it. The entire world collectively held its breath, waiting for the next monstrous note to tear through the stillness. And Martin, a man who sought peace, found himself instead on the precipice of an abyss, sensing that the ordinary, comforting world he knew was about to be irrevocably invaded. The New Mexico sun, a relentless eye in a cloudless sky, beat down on the corrugated tin roof of Martin's garage, turning the interior into a shimmering oven. Sweat trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes as he wrestled with the seized universal joint beneath the belly of his old, sputtering pickup. He was deeply engrossed, the familiar challenge of rusted metal and stubborn bolts, a welcome distraction from the lingering unease of the previous night. The metallic tang of ozone and that unsettling gamey smell had faded with the morning breeze. But the memory of the howl, raw and desolate, still clawed at the edges of his concentration. He grunted, twisting his wrench with all his might, when a shadow, long and impossibly still, fell across his grease-stained work boots. He slid out from under the truck, wiping a smear of oil from his forehead with the back of his hand, and straightened up slowly. Standing before him, materialized from the heat haze, was the neighbor. The man was tall, gaunt, his frame wrapped in an old, faded flannel shirt that bore the marks of countless seasons of dust and sun. His hair, what little there was beneath the brim of a battered cowboy hat, was streaked with gray, but it was not the gentle silvering of age. It was a harsh, brittle white, like dried bone. His face was a road map of deep-set lines, weathered and leathery, but not soft. Instead, it bore an unnerving stillness, an expression that was carved from stone. "Having some trouble there, friend?" The voice was a low rumble, surprisingly quiet, like the rustle of dry leaves skittering across a parched arroyo. It carried no discernible accent, just the weight of decades lived in solitude. Martin blinked, momentarily taken aback. This was the man of whispers, the phantom of curtained windows, the source of that unearthly howl. His name, he remembered the hushed conversations now, was Jack Ranson. Martin nodded a little awkwardly. "Yeah, this old beast is fighting me every step of the way. Transmission's seizing up." Jack Ranson's eyes. Martin noticed them then, and a shiver, cold and precise, traced a path down his spine despite the oppressive heat. They were yellow, not amber or hazel, but a deep, unsettling bile yellow, the color of old, stained parchment, a predator's gaze caught in the light. They looked directly at Martin, without a trace of a smile, and in their depths, Martin saw something ancient, something wild and watchful, like a desert cat observing its prey. There was no warmth in those eyes, only a profound predatory wariness, an alertness that pierced through Martin's own tired facade. "It is a linkage issue," Jack murmured, his gaze sweeping over the underside of the pickup. He took a step closer, and Martin unconsciously stiffened, picking up a faint scent. Not sweat, not dust, but something earthy, like damp soil after a long rain, mixed with a dry, musky odor, like old, sun-baked leather or cured fur. Jack's hands, Martin noticed, were large and powerful but strangely delicate. They looked like gnarled roots, thick and strong, with fingers that were unusually long, unnaturally articulated. They were rough, scarred, but moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long, hard labor. Without a word, Jack knelt beside Martin, his movements fluid and silent. He reached out, his fingers brushing against a greasy bolt. Martin felt a momentary flicker of surprise. The man's skin was strangely warm and dry to the touch, like a rock that had been baking under the relentless midday sun for hours. Jack pointed to a pin, his voice a low explanation of a common flaw in older models. Then, with a sudden unnerving swiftness, his fingers went to work. They were fast, precise, the kind of movements Martin had only ever seen in highly specialized mechanics. But there was something else in their quick efficiency, something animalistic, like a predator, breaking down its prey with instinctive, unerring accuracy. There was no wasted effort, no fumbling, not a single erroneous movement. He worked for 10 minutes, his breathing shallow, barely audible. While Martin watched, mesmerized by the sheer brutal efficiency of it. Jack did not ask for tools, did not hesitate. He knew. Finally, with a soft click, he reconnected the linkage. He wiped his hands on a rag Martin handed him, his yellow eyes meeting Martin's again, that same ancient wariness still burning in their depths. "It will hold you for a while," he said, his voice flat. He offered no further explanation, no small talk, no friendly advice. He simply stood up, dusting off his jeans. "Thanks," Martin managed, a little breathless. I appreciate it, really." Jack just gave a curt nod. "Keep your eyes open," he advised, his gaze drifting towards the distant hills, his voice carrying a subtle, imperceptible undertone of warning. "This desert, it hides things." Then, as abruptly as he had appeared, he turned and began to walk away, his tall figure receding into the shimmering heat. He moved with a peculiar gliding gait, leaving behind only the scent of damp earth and that other wild, indefinable musk like old, untanned fur. He did not look back, disappearing around the bend of the dusty road just as the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. Martin watched him go, a strange knot forming in his stomach. The rational part of his mind, the mechanic's mind that dealt in tangible, measurable facts, tried to process the encounter, to categorize it. A helpful, eccentric neighbor, an old desert rat with uncanny mechanical skills, but another deeper part of him, the part that had heard that howl the night before, recoiled. He worked late that evening, tidying up the garage, the incident with Jack replaying in his mind. As dusk deepened into that velvety, moonless night, he finally locked up and headed towards his house. Just as he reached the gravel path leading to his front door, his gaze fell to the soft, disturbed dust near the corner of the garage, where Jack had stood. There, clearly imprinted in the fine, yielding dirt, were 2 sets of tracks. One set was unmistakably human, bare footprints, long and narrow, with distinct, unnaturally splayed toes. Next to them, overlapping in places, was something else entirely. Huge tracks, enormous paw prints, clearly defined with visible pads and the distinct deep gouges of claws. Not dog, not coyote. Something much, much larger. Something predatory. Martin knelt, his hand hovering over the prints. A cold, dry wind blew through his chest. His heart, which had just begun to settle into a predictable rhythm, now skipped a beat, heavy and dull, a drum solo of growing dread. He stood there for a long moment, the chill deepening inside him, staring at the impossible juxtaposition of human and beast. The next day, Martin drove into the town for supplies, his pickup running smooth thanks to Jack's intervention. He tried to dismiss the tracks, to rationalize them away. He considered Jack had a large dog, a peculiar companion. He considered the dust had been disturbed by something else, the wind playing tricks. But the image of those yellow eyes, those gnarled, precise fingers, kept returning. He saw Jack later that afternoon standing near the butcher shop on Main Street. He was holding a package, heavy and dull red, from which a thin stream of blood dripped onto the dry earth. Raw meat. The sight itself was not unusual in a town where ranching was still a faint echo of its past, but it was the reaction of the street dogs that froze Martin. Usually, they were a lazy, mangy bunch, lying listlessly in patches of shade, barely bothering to lift their heads for passers-by. But as Jack emerged from the shop, their ears flattened, tails tucked tight between their legs. They whimpered, a low, terrified sound, and then, seeing death itself, they scattered, disappearing down alleys and behind buildings with an unnatural speed. A cold certainty, dry as the desert wind, snaked its way down Martin's spine. This was not just provincial prejudice. This was not just rumors. This was a premonition, a cold, hard fact that burrowed deep into his gut. Martin's mechanical mind, which thrived on logic and order, tried desperately to find a rational explanation, to assemble the pieces into a coherent picture. But all it found was a growing, terrifying abyss, a gaping maw of the unknown. He drove home slowly, the sun dipping towards the horizon, casting long, unsettling shadows across the landscape. The threshold of his small, dusty house, which had once represented a safe haven, a sanctuary from his past, now felt different. It was no longer just a line separating him from the world. It was a boundary, a demarcation between the familiar, predictable world he had known and the encroaching, terrifying reality that Jack Ranson, the man with yellow eyes and gnarled roots for hands, had brought with him from the shadows. The desert, Martin realized with a cold certainty, was not just empty. It was full of ancient things, waiting to be disturbed. The air inside the dusty Spur saloon was perpetually thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and generations of spilled hopes. An ancient, wheezing ceiling fan, a relic from a bygone era, spun lazily overhead, stirring the air more out of habit than efficacy. Its rhythmic creak and groan was the only consistent soundtrack in the room, a counterpoint to the low murmur of voices and the occasional clink of a glass. Behind the scarred oak bar, Old Man Hemlock, the proprietor, his face a topographical map of wrinkles and sun-baked memories, slowly wiped down the counter with a perpetually damp cloth. His eyes, rheumy and clouded with age, saw everything and nothing all at once. Martin, nursing a lukewarm Coors, found himself drawn into the orbit of Hemlock's low, conspiratorial whisper. The conversation had, predictably, turned to Jack Ranson, though his name was rarely spoken aloud, replaced by a vague nod towards the hills. Hemlock leaned closer, his voice dropping further, like dry leaves scuttling across a gravel road. Couple years back now, it was. Found a coyote out near the old Miller place, just on the outskirts. Torn to pieces it was. Something bigger, meaner, had gotten hold of it. And then, not a week later, Old Man Jenkins. His boy found him. Up in that crevice by the dry waterfall. Faceless, they said. Something had just scraped him clean off the world. He straightened up, picking up a glass and rubbing it with the same cloth, the sound of glass on fabric like the grinding of an old, decaying tooth. "Sheriff," Bless his heart. He went out there, poked around for days. He returned looking like he had seen a spectral presence, a vision worse than any specter. Said he could not prove a thing. No blood, not a single drop. No tracks neither, except for what the wind left. Clean as a whistle, he kept saying. Clean as a whistle. Made your skin crawl, hearing him say it. Hemlock's eyes, though rheumy, held a glint of genuine ancient fear. Folks suspected Ranson. He had just moved in, quiet as a tombstone. Did not talk to nobody. Kept to himself. And then, this. Hard to ignore. He trailed off, shrugging, but the message hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The town had its theories, its unspoken certainties. Martin, despite his inherent skepticism, found himself unable to dismiss them as easily as he once had. Not after the howl. Not after the tracks. That night, Martin found himself drawn, inexorably, to his bedroom window. The moon was fuller tonight. A pale, indifferent disk hanging high above the black silhouette of the hills. From his vantage point, he could just make out the dark, unassuming shape of Ranson's house. He tried to fight the morbid curiosity, the cold knot of fear and fascination that had taken root in his gut. But it was a losing battle. He had to look. He had to know. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the deep, oppressive silence, broken only by the chirr of crickets. Then a flicker. A faint, yellowish light pulsed in one of Ranson's curtained windows. A momentary gleam. Something passed in front of it. Martin held his breath, his eyes straining in the gloom. The light pulsed again, steadier this time, a dim internal glow. And then a shadow. A huge moving silhouette, filling the entire window. It was not the distinct, angular shape of a man. It was something else, something amorphous, shifting. It bent and stretched, contorting itself in ways that fit something far too large into a space too small. It rose, then sank, then swelled again, a fluid, monstrous dance behind the heavy curtains, hinting at immense power and an unsettling, predatory grace. Martin felt his throat constrict, a dry, metallic taste blooming on his tongue. The shadow lasted for several long, agonizing seconds before receding, leaving the window dark once more. The very air sucked the light out of the room. He stood there for a long time, rooted to the spot, long after the shadow had vanished, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Morning arrived with its usual blaze of light, but for Martin it brought no comfort. The memory of the shadow, impossibly large and grotesquely fluid, had clung to his mind like a burr, refusing to be dislodged. He had spent another restless night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the oppressive silence, imagining the shape shifting behind those dark curtains. He was pouring himself a cup of lukewarm coffee, the smell of stale grounds doing little to awaken him, when he noticed it. A small burlap sack, cinched with a piece of rough twine, rested on his front doorstep. It had not been there when he had gone to bed. A chill, colder than the morning air, snaked through him. He knelt, his fingers hesitating before he touched the rough fabric. It was heavy, strangely soft, and through the weave he caught the unmistakable scent of raw meat, rich and pungent, like something recently killed. Cautiously, he loosened the twine. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry desert grass, was a generous cut of venison, dark red and fresh, still faintly cool to the touch. He considered it a hunter's gift. But then his gaze fell on a small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath the meat. He picked it up. The note was brief, scrawled in a rough, jagged hand, the letters uneven and oddly angular, written with something hard and sharp. you heard. Now stay away. A gift? Yes, but a warning too. The words seeped into his very bones. The smell of the raw meat, now cloying and metallic, infiltrating through the cracks of his door, invading his sanctuary. It was more than a threat. It was a demonstration, a chilling affirmation that he had been seen, heard, and was now understood. This was not just a wild beast. This was something that comprehended, that observed, that was waiting for his reaction. Fear, cold and sharp, fought a brutal battle with curiosity, a burning, insistent spark that had been ignited the night before. Martin knew, deep down, that the sensible thing to do was to heed the warning, to turn away, to go back to his life of wrenches and oil and predictable repairs. But the curiosity, now an acute, painful splinter beneath his fingernail, was winning. He had to know. What was hidden behind that wall of silence, that smell of ancient meat, that history of old, disturbing stories? He felt a desperate, primal urge to peel back the layers, no matter the cost. His gut, usually so reserved, so rational, now burned with a strange, fierce heat. The solitude of this desert town, which he had so desperately sought, no longer was a comforting balm. Instead, it was an oppressive, suffocating weight, a vast, lurking anticipation that breathed down his neck, constantly reminding him of the terrifying presence just beyond the edge of his understanding. He was no longer an observer. He was implicated. The weather, mirroring the unsettling shift in Martin's own psyche, began to change. The sky above the town, usually a brilliant, uncompromising blue, now began to turn heavy, a leaden gray that pressed down on the horizon. It foretold a storm, but not one that would bring the cleansing rain the parched earth so desperately craved. No, this was a different kind of storm, a darker, more insidious tempest, one that would only rip away the last fragile remnants of peace and leave something far more terrible in its wake. Martin felt it in the air, a low thrumming, a vibration of unease that settled deep in his bones. The quiet was ending, and something else, something monstrous, was about to begin. The change in the town was palpable, a chilling transformation that spread through its inhabitants like a slow, creeping fever. The quiet whispers of the monster in the hills that had once been confined to the shadows of the dusty spur now morphed into outright, sticky fear, clinging to every face like the omnipresent dust. It started subtly, a missing dog here, a lost goat there. Then it escalated. A rancher reported an entire flock of sheep gone, vanished without a trace, leaving only disturbed earth and a faint, acrid smell that hinted at violence. The air became thick with anxiety, heavy with the metallic tang of human sweat and the sharp, familiar scent of gunpowder, the smell of old hunting rifles, suddenly pulled from storage, oiled and loaded, their presence a stark declaration of impending conflict. Martin noticed a disturbing rhythm, a pattern that once seen could not be unseen. Each time a new disappearance was reported, each time the air grew taut with fear and suspicion, Jack Ranson vanished. His house, perched at the foot of the hill, would become a tombstone, silent and utterly empty, its curtained windows now like dead, unseeing eye sockets in an ancient skull. Martin had watched, drawn by that same morbid fascination that had led him to the window, as Jack would simply disappear, sometimes for a full day, sometimes for 2. And then he would reappear as silently as he had left, only for the cycle of disappearances to begin anew. Unable to simply stand by, To ignore the mounting dread that had taken root in his soul, Martin decided to follow. It was a foolish, reckless impulse, he knew, born of a desperate need to understand, to rationalize. He waited until nightfall, until the moon, a dull, indifferent eye, hung high above the jagged silhouette of the hills. He watched Jack leave his house, a dark, indistinct figure moving with that peculiar, gliding gait, heading straight for the desert, for the low, dead hill behind his property. Jack knew the path, Martin realized. It was etched into his very bones, a deeply ingrained instinct. His silhouette, a stark cutout against the faint glow of the western horizon, slowly dissolved into the crimson dust and encroaching darkness, swallowed by the vast, indifferent emptiness. Martin waited, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs, until Jack was well out of sight. Then, grabbing the heavy wrench he now kept by his bedside, he set out, following the faintest disturbance in the sand, his eyes straining in the gloom. The desert night was a symphony of alien sounds, the rustle of unseen creatures, the dry whisper of the wind through brittle brush, the distant howl of a true coyote, a sound that now was benign in comparison to the one he had heard. The air, despite the chill, felt strangely heavy, charged with an invisible energy. He reached the low hill, its slopes covered in dry, scratching creosote bushes that clawed at his jeans as he pushed through them. He found the spot Jack had disappeared into, a small, rocky outcrop. There, among the bleached bones of ancient plants and scattered pebbles, he saw them. Fresh claw marks, deep, savage gouges in the hardened earth. Something impossibly heavy and sharp dragged itself across the ground. And next to them, caught on the thorny branches of a mesquite, were clumps of dark, coarse fur, the color of dried earth. He leaned closer, the smell hitting him then, a rank, musky odor, undeniably canine but wilder, more pungent than any dog. Mixed with it was that strange, metallic tang of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, leaving a taste like raw pennies in his mouth. The air around him thinned, became rarefied, saturated with an alien, palpable presence that pressed in on him from all sides. He was not alone. A cold dread, stark and immediate, seized him. This was not a dog. This was not a coyote. This was the source of the howls, the tracks, the disappearances. This was the monster. He turned to leave, a wave of nausea washing over him, his mind reeling from the impossible, undeniable evidence. That's when he felt it, not a sound, not a visual cue, but a distinct sensation, a prickling awareness on the back of his neck. An invisible pursuit, a breath, impossibly deep, impossibly close, stirred the fine hairs on his skin. The branches of the surrounding bushes, dead and brittle, remained utterly still, unmoving in the faint breeze. Yet Martin felt something moving, silently, inexorably, parallel to him, just beyond the edge of his vision. It was a presence, heavy and malevolent, tracking his every move. Terror, raw and ancient, scalded his throat, burning him like molten sand. He did not think. He reacted. He ran. He scrambled down the hill, stumbling over loose rocks and thorny bushes, his lungs burning, the air rasping in his throat. He could hear nothing but the frantic pounding of his own heart, a desperate drum beat in his ears. The fine red dust of the desert rose behind him like smoke, a crimson cloud obscuring the horizon, blurring the line between escape and pursuit. He ran until his legs screamed, until his chest ached, until his heart simply burst from exertion. He burst through the front door of his small house, slamming it shut with a dull, echoing thud that vibrated through the very foundations. His hands, shaking uncontrollably, fumbled for the deadbolt, the metallic click of the lock sounding impossibly fragile, pathetically unreliable against the invisible horror that still felt so close. He pressed his back against the cold, unyielding wood of the door, sliding down until he was hunched on the floor, his head bowed, his lungs heaving, his heart hammering out a wild, primal rhythm against his ribs. He stayed there for a long time, listening, straining his ears, but hearing nothing but the ragged sound of his own breathing. Finally, exhausted, terrified, he pushed himself up. He moved to the window of his bedroom, the one that faced the low, dead hill, and peered out, expecting and dreading what he saw. The moon was higher now, casting a pale, milky light over the desert. And there, on the crest of the hill, where he had found the claw marks in the fur, he saw them. 2 yellow points. They flickered, like embers in a dying fire, like twin predatory eyes, luminous in the profound darkness. They were still, waiting, watching. Then slowly, inexorably, they began to move, not towards him, but along the ridge, disappearing and reappearing, a slow, deliberate patrol. They were observing, studying. Martin pressed his face against the cool glass, his breath fogging the pain. The tension in his chest was unbearable, a vice-like grip that squeezed his lungs, robbing him of the ability to draw a full, deep breath. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the game had changed. He was no longer just an observer. He was now a player, a marked man, and the horror had finally found him. The darkness outside, once a comforting blanket of solitude, was now a boundless, terrifying expanse, hiding secrets he no longer wanted to uncover. Morning dawned a bruised and bloodied red, the kind of sunrise that was less like a promise and more like a warning. It brought with it a new, profound despair, thick and viscous as the blood that would soon soak the earth. Down the long, dusty road leading out of the town, past the scattering of ramshackle ranches, a shepherd named Old Man Higgins found his herds. He found what was left of them. The scene was an unspeakable tableau of carnage. Sheep torn apart, scattered in grotesque pieces across the trampled ground. The earth itself churned into a gruesome paste of soil, crimson gore, and matted wool. The air was heavy with the sweet, sickening smell of fresh death and fear. Higgins's screams when they finally tore from his throat were raw and ancient, piercing the fragile quiet of the early morning like a knife. They echoed across the desolate landscape, carrying a message of pure, unadulterated terror that needed no translation. Jack Ranson, of course, was gone again. His house, a dark silhouette against the fiery sunrise, stood like a fresh tombstone on the hill, silent and empty. The heavy curtains remained drawn, but this time the windows had been boarded up, crudely nailed planks sealing them shut, giving the house the aspect of a skull with freshly closed, dead eye sockets. It was a declaration, a silent testament to the horror that had been unleashed. The town, already on edge, now began to seethe. The quiet anxiety of the past few days erupted into a palpable collective frenzy. Men, their faces etched with lines of fear and a grim determination, their skin dried and cracked by the relentless sun and mounting stress, began to gather. They formed patrols, their numbers growing by the minute, their shoulders hunched, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the unseen menace. Rifles, old lever actions and newer bolt actions alike, glinted dully in the anemic morning light, their presence a stark, uncompromising statement. The sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder, a scent of impending violence already hung in the air, mixing with the pungent tang of panic and the raw electric odor of adrenaline. Martin, his sleep-deprived eyes red-rimmed, felt a cold, sticky sense of responsibility pulling him in. A deep, gnawing concern for the fragile community. For the terror that was gripping them overrode his personal dread. He joined one of the hastily assembled patrols, slinging a battered hunting weapon he had unearthed from the back of his garage over his shoulder. He felt ill, his stomach churning with a cold premonition, but he knew he could not stand idly by. He was a witness now, caught inextricably in the town's escalating nightmare. The patrol was a ragged line of men, some old and stooped, some young and jittery, all armed and grim-faced. They combed the scrubland on the outskirts of town, fanning out, moving with a tense, jerky caution, their boots crunching on the dry earth. The sun climbed higher, relentless and unforgiving, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Hours passed in an agonizing silence, broken only by the crackle of dry brush underfoot and the occasional nervous cough. Then they found it. Deep in a patch of particularly dense, fire-scorched creosote bushes, partially hidden from view, lay Marino's overturned pickup truck. Marino was one of the younger men, a ranch hand known for his quick temper and even quicker hands. The truck was a twisted wreck of shattered glass and mangled metal, its tires ripped from their rims, the chassis bent at an impossible angle. Something of immense, unimaginable strength simply flipped it like a toy. A collective gasp, a ragged, terrified sound went through the patrol. They approached cautiously, weapons raised, their breaths held tight in their chests. Inside the ruined cab, the horror intensified. Fresh blood, dark, sticky, already beginning to congeal in the oppressive heat. Its thick metallic scent, like rust and old copper, filled Martin's nostrils, making his stomach clench violently. There were no bodies, no Marino. Just the ripped, shredded remains of his flannel shirt, clinging to a broken seatbelt, and the sharp, utterly unbearable scent of death, ancient and immediate, saturating every molecule of air. It was a slaughterhouse, a scene of impossible, visceral brutality. The silence that followed, a sudden, suffocating vacuum, was broken by an immediate, deafening roar. It ripped through the stillness, a sound so primal, so profound, that it vibrated in the very bones of the earth, shaking the air around them. It was a sound that belonged to a world long past, a world of tooth and claw and primeval terror. Then, from the depths of the scorched bushes, it burst forth. An enormous figure, a blur of brown fur and coiled muscle, moving with a terrifying, impossible speed. It was inhuman, undeniably monstrous, yet with a horrifying, recognizable anatomy. Its frame was immense, far larger than any wolf or bear Martin had ever imagined. Its shoulders thick with muscle, its spine arcing in a predatory curve. Claws, long and wickedly curved, glinted like sharpened obsidian blades in the harsh sunlight as it moved. And its eyes, those were the same yellow points Martin had seen watching him from the hill, now burning with an incandescent feral fury. The creature, its guttural roar still vibrating in the air, let out a piercing, unearthly howl, a sound of pure, untamed rage that clawed at Martin's sanity. Then it charged. It did not stalk. It did not hunt. It simply surged forward, a living embodiment of wrath, a locomotive of muscle and instinct, straight at the terrified patrol. Panic, immediate and absolute, erupted. Men screamed, their voices hoarse with terror. Firearms barked, spitting fire and lead. Bullets, fired in blind, desperate haste, zipped through the air, many missing their target entirely. But those that struck the creature did little more than enrage it further, sparking off its thick, matted hide like flint, eliciting deeper, more savage roars. This was no mere beast. This was something else entirely. Something ancient, something too old, too raw, to be simply an animal. It was a force of nature, an embodiment of pure, unadulterated, unthinking violence. And it was coming for them. The creature, now fully visible in the harsh, unflinching sunlight, was a nightmare made flesh. It moved with a speed that defied logic, a terrifying blur of muscle and malice. Its fur, a mottled dark brown, bristled along its spine, and its teeth, visible in a perpetual snarl, were long, dagger-like, gleaming wetly. The eyes, those dreadful yellow orbs, burned with an intelligent ancient fury, reflecting no mercy, only a primal, consuming rage. It was less a beast and more a living, breathing embodiment of ancient vengeance. It descended upon Marino, the ranch hand, with an impossible, sickening swiftness. Marino, caught mid-scream, barely had time to register the horror. A single, brutal strike of the creature's massive claw, too quick for the human eye to follow, too powerful for bone and flesh to withstand. There was a wet, tearing sound, followed by a choked, gurgling gasp. Marino's throat, thick and muscular just moments before, was simply horribly ripped open. Blood, bright and arterial, erupted in a hot, geysering fountain, spraying across the dry grass, coating the already crimson-dusted earth. Its scent, sweet and metallic, sickeningly familiar, was instantly overpowering, hitting Martin's nostrils with the force of a physical blow, turning his stomach. The patrol dissolved into utter chaos. Men screamed, their cries hoarse with abject terror, firing their firearms blindly, wildly, the sharp cracks of the gunshots echoing erratically across the desert. Some, their faces pale and contorted, simply dropped their weapons and ran, their panicked shouts fading into the distant, indifferent emptiness of the scrubland. Martin, frozen in a tableau of pure, unadulterated horror, watched the scene unfold, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible savagery. It surpassed anything he had ever known, anything he had ever imagined. His hands, usually so steady, so precise, now trembled so violently that the hunting weapon he still clutched was a dead weight, threatening to slip from his grasp. The beast, oblivious to the bullets that peppered its thick hide, some deflecting with a dull thud, others merely tearing shallow furrows, moved with an incredible fluid speed, its immense body a living engine of muscle and fury. It was not hunting in the conventional sense, not stalking prey for sustenance. No, its movements were imbued with a grim, terrible purpose. It was avenging. Every slash of its claw, every guttural roar, was saturated with an ancient, unbearable pain, a deep-seated injustice that spanned centuries. It was not a beast of hunger. It was a beast of retribution. As the creature spun, its yellow eyes sweeping over the scattering men, Martin saw an old firearm lying abandoned in the dust, dropped by a fleeing rancher. Instinct, sharp and primitive, took over. He dropped his own weapon, grabbed the firearm, its cold, wet metal, damp with the rancher's sweat and fear, slick against his trembling fingers. He aimed. the twin barrels wavering wildly, but a sudden profound paralysis gripped his body. His finger hovered over the trigger, his rational mind screaming at him to fire, to fight, to survive. But something deeper, something primal and unsettling, held him back. Something inside him refused to shoot this creature, this embodiment of despair and ancient pain. It was a recognition, a horrifying understanding, that this thing was more than just an animal. It was a testament, a consequence, and in its rage, Martin saw a terrible mirroring reflection. The chaos intensified, escalating into a pure, unbearable cacophony. The air became a noxious cocktail of smells. The coppery tang of fresh blood, the pungent, metallic scent of fear, the gut-wrenching aroma of torn flesh, all mixing with the acrid, choking smoke of expended gunpowder. The desperate screams of the men, the guttural, enraged snarls of the beast, the deafening cracks of gunfire, all merged into one wild, insane melody of death and terror. Martin's paralysis broke, but not into action. Instead, a wave of sheer, unthinking panic washed over him, a powerful, irresistible tide. He dropped the firearm and simply ran. He bolted blindly, wildly, his feet pounding against the hard-baked earth. He stumbled, falling headlong into the billowing dust, the impact jarring his teeth, but scrambled up instantly, his lungs burning raw and ragged with every desperate breath. The pain in his chest, the fire in his throat, was nothing compared to the overwhelming terror that propelled him forward. He did not dare look back, not even for a fleeting second. The certainty that death, invisible yet terrifyingly tangible, was breathing down his neck. He could feel its presence, a cold, heavy weight pressing against his back, urging him onward. He ran until his vision blurred, until the world narrowed to nothing but the desperate need to find shelter. He finally collapsed, gasping, into the dubious refuge of a half-collapsed, abandoned shack, its rusted tin roof groaning faintly in the wind. He wedged himself into a dark corner, barely able to draw a breath, his lungs on fire. Through a cracked, splintered seam in the rotting wall, he peered out, his heart still hammering a furious rhythm. In the deepening twilight, he saw them, the two yellow eyes. They glowed, impossibly bright from the edge of the scrubland, sweeping the area, searching. They knew precisely where he was hiding. They were not just seeing. They were seeing him. The guilt, a crushing weight in his gut, mixed with a profound, terrifying sense of powerlessness. He could not scream, could not even draw a full breath, his throat constricted by an invisible vise of terror and complicity. He had seen too much, and now he knew it had seen him. The hunt, he realized with a sickening lurch, had merely begun. The first tentative fingers of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in violent, bruised hues of crimson and deep violet. For Martin, huddled in the cramped, dust-choked corner of the abandoned shack, it brought no relief. The light, thin and watery, merely illuminated the extent of his terror, did nothing to dispel the lingering scent of blood and fear that still clung to him. His body ached, every muscle screaming from the desperate flight, but a different kind of ache, colder and deeper, resided in his soul. He trembled, not just from the residual shock, but from a profound, terrifying realization. He needed answers. The events of the previous day had shattered his rational world, leaving him adrift in an ocean of the impossible. And the only place where he found a mooring, a clue, a single shred of understanding, was Jack Ranson's house. He moved with a grim, determined urgency, his steps hesitant at first, then gaining a kind of desperate momentum. The morning air was thin and sharp, carrying the faint, distant wail of police sirens, a sound that was woefully inadequate against the scale of the horror they had witnessed. He reached Ranson's property, a small, isolated clearing at the base of the hill. The house, dark and silent, still bore the crude, boarded-up windows like blank, unseeing eyes. He approached cautiously, his hand instinctively clutching the heavy wrench he still carried. The front door, surprisingly, was unlocked. It simply had not been secured in the rush of Jack's departure. It groaned open with a mournful creak, revealing an interior steeped in a profound, suffocating stillness. The air inside was thick, stagnant, heavy with a pervasive dust that shimmered in the weak light filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows. It smelled of old, decaying wood, of dry desert earth, of something metallic and ancient, but also something else. A faint electric tang like ozone, mixed with that unsettling musky scent he now associated with Jack. It sent shivers crawling across his skin. The house was sparsely furnished, Spartan to the point of asceticism. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of red dust. Time itself had simply stopped here, leaving everything in a state of suspended animation. Martin moved through the small living room, his footsteps muffled by the dust. His eyes scanned for anything, any hint, any explanation. He found them in a back room, a small study, its single, narrow window also boarded shut. On a rough-hewn wooden desk, amidst a scattering of dried herbs and curious polished stones, lay a stack of old leather-bound books and several loose yellowed notebooks. He picked up one of the notebooks, its pages brittle with age. The writing was small, cramped, a sprawling, intricate script that filled every available space. It was Jack Ranson's hand. Martin began to read, his eyes racing across the pages, absorbing the words that spilled forth. Stories, impossibly old, impossibly fantastic, too incredible, too ancient to be mere fiction. They spoke of the land, of cycles, of transformations, of a primal spirit rooted deep within the earth itself. They spoke of a burden, a curse, passed down through generations, a responsibility born of blood and soil. Among the pages he found photographs, faded and sepia-toned, brittle with the passage of decades. One showed a younger Jack in his 20s, dressed in a crisply pressed uniform from World War II, his face lean and grim, his eyes already holding that unsettling yellow hue. Another photograph, even older, depicted the same man, unmistakably Jack Ranson, but in the fashions of the 1930s, a fashion that predated it. His face, though younger, was strikingly similar, unlined, untouched by the relentless march of time. Martin stared, his breath catching in his throat. Jack had not aged a day. Time itself was powerless over him. He was carved from the very stone of the desert, an eternal, unchanging sentinel. A cold dread mingled with a burgeoning, terrible understanding. This was not just a man. This was something else. Something ancient. Something enduring. He continued his search, drawn by an unspoken intuition to the basement. A heavy wooden door, indistinguishable from the wall, led to a narrow, creaking staircase. He descended slowly, the air growing colder, heavier, denser with the smell of damp earth and deep, geological time. Goosebumps erupted on his skin, a visceral reaction to the profound chill. The basement was a single cavernous room, its walls roughly hewn, its floor bare concrete. In the center of the room, stark and unsettling in the dim light, stood a series of massive steel cages, They were empty now, their doors hanging open, but their bars were scarred with deep, savage scratches, gouges that could only have been made by something incredibly powerful, something with claws of unimaginable strength. Nearby, the concrete floor bore the unmistakable marks of heavy chains, deep furrows worn into the cement, forming strange, disturbing patterns. Something thrashed against them for untold hours, even days. But there was no blood, not a single drop, no stray clumps of fur, no torn scraps of flesh. Only tucked into one corner a few tattered remnants of an old flannel shirt, crumpled and dirty, identical in weave and color to the one Jack often wore. A soft scraping sound. Martin whirled around, the wrench raised instinctively. From the deepest shadows of the basement, from the very core of the earth's cold embrace, Jack Ranson emerged. He was different. His face was pale, translucent, drawn and haggard, etched with lines of profound exhaustion. His bare feet, calloused and scraped, bore fresh cuts, still weeping faintly. His body, usually held with such an unnatural stillness, now sagged, carrying an immense invisible weight. But his eyes, those same yellow eyes, burned with an ancient fathomless sorrow, a deep, weary sadness that spoke of millennia of solitude and pain. "You came," he said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, like sand scraping against parched throat. It was not a question, but a simple, fatalistic statement of fact. Martin could only nod, his own throat too tight for words. Jack slowly sat down on the cold concrete floor, his back against one of the scarred cages. He spoke, his voice low, a monotone, recounting a story he had told countless times, a story as old as the desert itself. He spoke of a curse, of a beast that resided within him, a primal entity that awoke with each cycle of the moon, growing stronger, more ravenous, with the passage of time. He spoke of a constant, brutal struggle, a fight that had lasted for decades, for centuries, against the rising tide of that ancient hunger. He spoke of the unbearable, eternal loneliness that came with such a burden, of watching worlds change while he remained trapped in an unending, horrifying cycle. "The town," Jack rasped, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. Its fear, its blood, all of it. It woke him. They were always poking, always digging. I tried to contain it. I tried to keep it bound, but they would not let me. They left me no choice. They left me no room. His voice was devoid of self-pity, only a profound, exhausted resignation. He looked at Martin then, those yellow eyes holding a flicker of something akin to pleading. "You do not know what I see, what I feel, when I lose myself. The hunger, the rage. It consumes everything. I cannot control it. Not anymore. Not now that they have stirred it so deeply." He paused, a long, drawn-out silence. "Run, Martin. Go. While I'm still... me." His words hung in the cold, damp air, sounding like a death rattle, a final, desperate plea from a soul on the precipice of obliteration. Martin felt the ground literally slip out from under his feet, his carefully constructed world dissolving into a chilling, impossible reality. He was standing face to face with a monster. Yes, but a monster burdened by a terrible, ancient sorrow, a monster who had once been a man, and was now offering him a final, desperate act of mercy. The weight of that knowledge, cold and crushing, settled upon Martin's shoulders. The sheriff, a thick-necked man named Billy, his face blotchy with fury and fear, stood on the porch of the dusty spur, his voice hoarse from shouting, straining to be heard above the growing din of the crowd. "He's a monster," he bellowed, his words thick with the righteous indignation of a man whose world had just been irrevocably violated. He killed our own. He killed Marino. Burn his lair to the ground. Smoke him out. The mob, an ugly, volatile entity, surged and roared, a hive of wild wasps agitated to a frenzy. Torches, hastily lit, cast flickering monstrous shadows across their faces, contorting them into masks of primal fear and murderous hatred. Firearms glinted in the dimming twilight, their cold steel reflecting the growing, savage fire in their eyes. The air hummed with a terrifying, bloodthirsty energy. Martin, his mind still reeling from Jack's confession, stumbled from the house, his steps clumsy, disoriented. He had fled, not from Jack, but from the unbearable weight of the truth, from the horrific clarity of what Jack had become. But the town had already caught fire. The mob, a wave of incandescent rage, was already moving inexorably towards Ranson's house, their collective roar rising into a deafening crescendo. Jack Ranson emerged from the shadows of his porch, stepping out into the fading light, his figure stark against the backdrop of the enraged crowd. He moved with a strange, serene calm, his face pale, his shoulders slumped, but his yellow eyes held a profound, tragic resignation. He did not raise his hands, did not utter a word of protest, did not make any move to defend himself. He simply stood there, a solitary rock cast into a raging sea, waiting for the inevitable. He was an offering, a sacrifice. A man at the front of the mob, his face twisted into a mask of pure terror, his hands trembling violently, raised an old hunting weapon. He squeezed the trigger. The gunshot cracked sharply in the evening air, startlingly loud. The bullet struck Jack squarely in the chest, and that's when it happened. It was not a slow transformation, not a gradual shift. It was a terrifying, instantaneous explosion of flesh and bone. A sickening, wet crunch resonated through the air as Jack's bones cracked and shifted, impossibly, grotesquely. His skin tore, stretched taut, then ripped as a thick, coarse brown fur erupted from beneath, coating his entire frame in seconds. His clothes, the old flannel shirt, the worn jeans, shredded, flying into 1,000 useless tatters. His fingers elongated, contorted, hardening into wickedly curved claws, sharp as obsidian daggers, growing from the tips of his digits. His face stretched, lengthened, contorting into a bestial muzzle, his nose flattening, his jaw jutting forward, revealing teeth that were no longer human. His eyes, those dreadful yellow orbs, flared, burning with a pure, untamed wildfire, a terrible, ancient agony reflecting in their depths. The beast was no longer a hidden presence. It was fully unleashed, raw and terrifying. The screams of the mob, already shrill, escalated into a collective shriek of pure, unadulterated horror. They were no longer angry. They were simply terrified. Then the slaughter began. The creature, immense and terrible, lunged. Its movements were not malicious in the human sense, not driven by petty hatred. They were purposeful, driven by an instinct far older than human understanding. It was defense. It was despair. And it was a furious, terrible vengeance for centuries of persecution, for countless moons of forced confinement, for the simple act of trying to exist in a world that refused to comprehend it. Its massive claws scythed through the air, finding flesh, bone, and sinew with horrifying ease. Screams of agony ripped through the night, punctuated by the dull thuds of gunshots, the futile pops of their primitive firearms, the sickening crunch of breaking bones, the wet thud of impact, the desperate dying gurgles of men, all melded into a symphony of pure terror. The air, already thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear, became cloying, suffocating, saturated with the coppery tang of fresh blood and the primal stench of torn flesh. Martin, caught in the terrifying kaleidoscopic maelstrom, was frozen. His mind, still grappling with the transformation, simply could not process the sheer, brutal efficiency of the slaughter. But then, a flash of movement, a small, fragile form. A child. A little girl, no older than 5, stood by an old, abandoned pickup truck at the edge of the chaos, her small face contorted in a silent scream of pure terror, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. Instinct, pure and unthinking, overrode everything else. Martin did not hesitate. He lunged, grabbing the child, his hands clamping over her mouth to stifle her terrified sobs. He pulled her down, shielding her with his own body behind the rusted frame of the pickup, pressing her face against his chest, trying to block out the horrific sights and sounds. His own breath caught, frozen in his lungs. His heart stopped altogether, suspended in the unbearable tension of the moment. He could feel the vibrations of the beast's movements, the thud of its paws on the ground, the guttural snarls, all too close. The beast, a massive, blood-soaked silhouette against the burning torches, turned its head. Its yellow eyes, still burning with that ancient, terrible pain, met Martin's across the short, brutal distance. In that gaze, Martin saw not just primal fury, but a profound, weary understanding, and a flicker of something else, a final, silent farewell, a recognition of a shared, terrible secret. Then, with a guttural roar that tore at the very foundations of the earth, it turned and vanished. It leaped into the enveloping darkness of the desert, a dark, primal shadow melting into the deeper shadows of the hills, dissolving into the vast, indifferent emptiness, leaving behind only the unbearable horror, the dead, echoing silence, and the chilling, undeniable truth of what had just transpired. Morning came, not with a cleansing light, but with an oppressive, leaden pall. It brought with it only ash and an unbearable, suffocating horror that clung to the town like a shroud. Jack Ranson's house, the focal point of the previous night's madness, was a charred skeleton on the low hill, its timbers reduced to blackened, crumbling remnants, its foundations merely a blackened scar on the earth. The air still held the acrid tang of smoke, mixing with the cloying, metallic scent of dried blood that had soaked into the desert floor. The bodies, what remained of them, were found at dawn, scattered across the scrubland. They were collected, grimly, silently, by the handful of deputies who arrived from the county seat, their faces pale and sickened. They were buried quickly, without ceremony, without the usual rituals of mourning, without a single word of farewell. There was nothing to say, no comfort to be offered. The town, stunned and utterly broken, descended into a deep, oppressive silence, a grave-like stillness that felt heavier, more absolute than any silence Martin had ever known. It pressed down on everything, suffocating, crushing. Sheriff Billy, his face now a sickly, ashen gray, like the dust that coated every surface, gave his official statement to the few reporters who dared venture into the desolate town. "Jack Ranson was the monster," he declared, his voice hollow and flat, devoid of its previous bluster. "He was the beast that terrorized this county. He's gone, run off into the desert. Good riddance." He offered no further explanation, no details, only the grim satisfaction that the immediate threat had vanished. But even as he spoke, His eyes darted nervously towards the hills, betraying the lie in his words. No remains of the creature had been found, just the devastation. His words sounded hollow, like the dull, heavy thud of a hammer striking an empty barrel, an attempt to impose order on a chaos that defied understanding. And no one, not a single soul in the broken town, dared to contradict him. They simply nodded, their eyes wide with fear, silently accepting the convenient narrative. Martin, utterly devastated, felt a profound, chilling emptiness in his soul. Sleep became an impossible dream, a cruel joke. Every night when the darkness deepened, he saw them, those terrible yellow eyes, burning with ancient fury, flashing in the blackness behind his eyelids. He heard it, the sickening crunch of bones, the tearing of flesh, the guttural snarls of the beast, the desperate screams of the dying. The pervasive coppery smell of blood, that sweet, sickening tang, had permanently embedded itself in his nostrils, clinging to him like a second skin. The images, stark and visceral, haunted him like malevolent specters, replaying in an endless, horrifying loop in his mind. Jack's last warning, delivered in that dry, rasping whisper in the cold basement, echoed in his ears, now imbued with a terrifying clarity. "You do not know what I see when I lose myself." Now, Martin did know. He had seen it himself. He had witnessed the raw, primal horror, the unbridled fury, the terrible, ancient sorrow. And now he knew, and that knowledge, cold and unyielding, burned from deep within him, an inferno that consumed his peace, his reason, his very soul. His former world, the rational, predictable world of mechanics, of clear instructions and tangible facts, had utterly crumbled to dust. It was gone, shattered into a million irreparable fragments. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could never return to his old life, to the comforting rhythm of wrenches and oil, to the simple, logical satisfaction of fixing a broken engine. That world was a distant, irrelevant memory. Now he saw shadows where there had once been only light, felt an undeniable presence where there had once been only emptiness. The desert, which had once promised oblivion, now pulsed with a terrifying ancient life, a constant reminder of the monstrous truth he now carried. He made a decision, a silent, weighty choice that settled deep in his bones. He would stay, not because he had nowhere else to go. He had the option to leave, pack up his truck, drive until the horror faded from his rearview mirror. But he could not. He simply could not bring himself to abandon this place, this land, this terrible, beautiful secret. He had become a part of this mystery, of this desolate earth, of this alien, horrifying fate. He was now inextricably bound, regardless of his will or fear. He began to study Jack's diaries again, poring over the cramped, sprawling script, trying to piece together the scattered fragments of the puzzle, to understand the true origin, the terrible nature of the curse. Each word he read, each strange symbol, each faded drawing, resonated deep within his soul, a distant, muffled drumbeat, pulling him deeper into the ancient, terrifying heart of the land's secrets. He was no longer just reading a story. He was becoming part of it. The quiet was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with whispers, with echoes, with the terrifying certainty that the beast was out there, and that he, Martin Clay, was now inexplicably, terrifyingly connected to it. The diaries of Jack Ranson were not merely the ramblings of a tormented man. They were a chronicle, a meticulous, agonizing record of an ancient evil etched in blood and despair. As Martin delved deeper into the brittle pages, the stories unfolded, revealing a history far older and more profound than any local rumor. This was not just a curse in the conventional sense, not a simple affliction passed down through a tainted bloodline. This was something woven into the very fabric of the land itself. Its roots burrowed deep into the bedrock of local Native American legends, tales of earth spirits and vengeful guardians. The creature, Martin slowly understood, was not merely a werewolf, a beast of pure, unthinking malice. It was something far more complex, far more tragic. It was a duende, a spirit guardian of the land, twisted and corrupted, distorted over centuries by human pain, by the endless cycle of human cruelty, by the relentless disrespect shown to the ancient, sacred earth. It was a manifestation of the land's own suffering, its rage given physical form. The transformation, Jack had meticulously documented, was not a punishment, but a rebirth, a primal, desperate reaction from the land itself, a guttural, enraged cry for protection against those who came only to exploit and destroy. Martin found repeated cryptic mentions of something called the Heart of the Hill, a place of immense power, a sacred convergence where the spirit, the primal essence of the creature, was bound, held in check by ancient rituals, or unleashed, set free to wreak havoc. It was not a magical spell, not a simple incantation. It was a connection, a conduit to the earth's raw, untamed energy. Driven by a desperate need for understanding, Martin began to explore the desolate landscape around the town, guided by the vague, poetic clues in Jack's writings. He traversed the endless expanse of dust and wind, ventured into the labyrinthine depths of the arroyos and the sun-baked, deserted canyons. The land itself felt different now, imbued with a newfound sentience. He felt the subtle vibrations of the earth beneath his worn boots. The ground was alive, a vast, ancient entity breathing slowly, deeply, beneath its crust of rock and sand. The wind, once just a dry rasp, now carried whispers, faint and imperceptible, of things seen and unseen, of ancient sorrows and silent watchers. During one such solitary expedition, deep within a particularly remote, desolate canyon, where the red rock walls towered like silent sentinels, Martin stumbled upon them. Ancient petroglyphs, carefully etched into the smooth, weathered stone, hidden away from the prying eyes of the modern world. The walls of the canyon, cracked and seamed with the erosion of millennia, breathed with eternity. The images were stark, primal, haunting. They depicted human figures, their forms subtly shifting, transforming into the distinct, powerful silhouettes of beasts, men turning into wolves, bears, something else, something far more monstrous. And above them all, dominating the compositions, was a huge blazing moon, a symbol of primal power and terrifying change. These were not mere drawings. They were warnings etched into the stone with the blood of centuries, a terrifying prophecy frozen in time. Understanding, cold and profound, crashed over Martin like a physical avalanche, taking his breath away. It was a revelation that shook him to his core. Jack Ranson had not been cursed in the way he had always imagined, afflicted by some external malevolent force. Number. Jack had become the curse. His transformation, his burden, had not been a punishment, but a terrible, potent form of protection. The land itself, in its ancient wisdom and despair, had chosen him, imbued him with its primal power, transformed him into its guardian, its avenger. He was meant to defend it from those who came, generation after generation, to desecrate and destroy. Jack had been the vessel, the unwilling instrument of the Earth's furious will. Martin's mind, which had spent decades meticulously dissecting the precise logic of mechanical systems, now saw patterns in the chaos, a terrible, intricate tapestry woven from myth and blood. He felt a connection, ancient and unbreakable, to this land, to this terrible secret. The monster, he realized with a sickening lurch, was not evil in the human sense. It was not driven by malice. It was merely a reflection of the land's profound ancient wrath, its last, desperate cry against the ceaseless depredations of humanity. A cry that no one until now had truly been willing to hear or understand. The beast was an echo, a consequence, a mirror reflecting humanity's own monstrous capacity for destruction. And then, a final, chilling piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Martin realized that the heart of the hill, the place of immense power where the spirit was bound or freed, was not some distant mythical location. It stood precisely where Jack Ranson's house had stood, beneath the charred remains of its foundations, deep in the earth. It was not just a geographical point. It was a boundary, a thin, permeable membrane between worlds, the very point of contact where the human and the wild, the mundane and the monstrous, converged. He felt a terrible, inescapable pull, drawing him back to the ashes, back to the source, to the heart of the enigma that had now utterly consumed him. The return to the ashes of Ranson's house was not a journey Martin wanted to make, but an inexorable pull, a gravitational force drawing him back to the epicenter of the horror. The air, even weeks later, still smelled faintly of char and scorched earth, a constant reminder of the inferno that had consumed everything. In the center of the blackened ruins, amidst the dust and fine ash that covered the ground like a gray, morbid snow, Martin's eyes fell upon it. An amulet. Small, dark, and utterly charred, but still recognizable. It was a piece of rough, dark stone etched with ancient swirling symbols. They were burned into the very core of the earth itself. The same stone he had seen in Jack's old photographs, hanging from a leather thong around his neck. The same stone he now knew was the key, the conduit, the very anchor of Jack's existence. He knelt, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached out and touched the stone. A jolt, immediate and visceral, passed through him. First, a wave of profound, bone-deep cold. He had just plunged his hand into an icy mountain stream. Then, an equally intense rush of warmth, spreading through his arm, through his chest, a surging energy that felt ancient and raw and impossibly powerful. It was the energy of the earth itself, untamed and potent, flowing through his fingertips, through his very being. And then, the memories. Not his own, but fragments, fleeting images, like shards of broken glass reflecting a distant, terrible light. He saw vast, primeval forests, long since turned to dust, teeming with wild, unseen beasts. He felt immense pain, a profound, agonizing sorrow that was not his own. He saw flashes of fire, of destruction, of relentless human encroachment. He witnessed the ceaseless, brutal cycle of life and death, of transformation and rebirth, all compressed into an agonizingly brief, overwhelming torrent of raw emotion and sensory input. He saw, truly saw, through the eyes of the beast, through the eyes of the land itself. It was then that he began to understand, with a terrifying, absolute clarity, that the curse, as it had been called, was never a random affliction. It was a choice, an inheritance, a sacred and terrible burden passed down through generations. It did not simply happen to anyone. It chose its carriers. It selected those who were strong enough, resilient enough, even lonely enough to bear its immense weight, to become its vessel. And Jack Ranson, with his quiet life, his deep, unspoken attachment to this desolate land, his inherent solitude, had been chosen. He was not a victim. He was a guardian, a reluctant sentinel. In one of Jack's last, most agonizing entries, Martin found a phrase, scrawled in a hand so shaky, so desperate it was barely legible. It was a prophecy, a final, terrible warning. When the time comes, the one who understands must make a choice between the world of men, greedy and blind, and a world that is older than the stars and demands sacrifices. The words reverberated in Martin's mind, a chilling echo that resonated with the profound truth he had just experienced through the amulet. Martin finally understood. Jack, in that desperate final confrontation, had not simply succumbed to the beast. He had consciously, deliberately unleashed it. When the town, blinded by its own fear and hatred, had turned on him, their weapons and torches burning with a savage, self-righteous fury, Jack had opened the gates. It was not an act of thoughtless, feral violence, not mere retribution. It was a sacrifice, a terrible, necessary act. He had used the beast to hold up a mirror to the people, to reflect back to them their own inherent savagery, their own monstrous capacity for wildness and destruction. He had shown them the true face of their own ignorance, their own hatred. He had made them confront the beast within themselves, a beast far more terrifying than any creature of flesh and blood. His own transformation, Martin realized, was not physical. He was not growing fur or claws, was not feeling the primal urge to hunt. His change was far deeper, far more insidious. It was mental, spiritual. He was no longer the detached observer, the rational mechanic who sought only to fix what was broken. That Martin Clay was gone, shattered irrevocably in the furnace of his experiences. He had become a witness, yes, but more than that, he had become an accomplice, not in the violence, but in the understanding. He now carried the weight of this terrible knowledge, this unbearable truth, a silent testament to the raw, ancient power that lay beneath the surface of the world, a power that demanded its due. He saw the evidence of this new understanding in the town itself. After the horrific events, after the beast had vanished into the desert, the people of the town had not learned. They had not grown. Instead, they had become even more suspicious, even more insular, their faces now carved from the same hard, unforgiving stone as the surrounding landscape. Their eyes held a haunted, defensive quality, and their conversations were clipped, wary, filled with unspoken accusations. They had never truly grasped the horrifying truth that the monster, the terrifying creature that had brought such devastation, was merely a reflection, a mirror held up to their own souls, reflecting back their own deep-seated hatred, their own capacity for primal violence. They blamed the beast, but they were the beast. And Martin, burdened with this chilling understanding, knew he could never unsee it. He was now irrevocably changed, a man forever standing on the precipice between worlds. Weeks bled into months, each day a slow, deliberate erosion of what little life remained in the little town. The red dust continued its ceaseless, sifting dance, covering everything, burying memories under its relentless tide. The town became quieter, a hollowed-out shell, more desolate than before. The very breath was sucked out of its collective lungs. People left, first a trickle, then a steady stream, their cars raising plumes of dust on the long, lonely road that led out, away from the silence, away from the lingering scent of ash and fear. Each departing vehicle was another nail in the town's coffin, another shard of hope shattered. The town was dying, faster now, its demise accelerated by the horror it had endured. But Martin stayed. He went back to his garage, to the familiar comfort of his tools, the smell of oil and worn metal. He fixed old engines, replaced worn-out parts, his hands moving with the same precise, practiced motions. But his gaze, whenever he paused, was no longer confined to the intricate workings of a carburetor or the smooth curve of a piston. It was always drawn to the hills, to the distant horizon, to the towering red rocks that rose like ancient gods from the desert floor, guardians of secrets far older than any human memory. He searched, not just with his eyes, but with a deeper sense, a spiritual antenna for Jack, for his presence, for the echo of the beast. The seasons changed. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the crisp, clear days of autumn, then the sharp, dry cold of winter, and finally, the tentative rebirth of spring. Martin repaired an old farmer's tractor, replacing a cracked head gasket, the familiar smell of grease and gasoline a brief, comforting anchor in his changed world. As the sun began to dip towards the western rim of the world, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked out towards the red rocks. And then he saw him. On the horizon, silhouetted against the dying embers of the sunset among the ancient silent sentinels of the red rocks, was a figure. It was no longer a man. It was a silhouette, immense and powerful, unmistakable. 4 massive paws, planted firmly on the earth, supporting a powerful, muscled torso. A back covered in thick, coarse fur, blending seamlessly with the long, deep shadows cast by the setting sun, making it impossible to discern where beast ended and landscape began. It moved slowly, deliberately, with a profound, primal grace, flowing with the contours of the earth, becoming one with the vast, indifferent expanse of the desert. It had returned. It had never truly left. But then, for a single, breathtaking moment, the creature stopped. It turned its massive head, its silhouette stark against the last vestiges of light. And Martin felt it. He felt the weight of those yellow eyes, those ancient, knowing eyes, looking directly at him, across miles of dusty, barren land, across the vast, echoing silence, across the chasm of pain and terror and profound understanding. And then, slowly, deliberately, the creature dipped its head. A single, profound nod. It was not a greeting, not a threat. It was something deeper. Not a goodbye, but an acceptance. A profound, wordless comprehension that transcended language, transcended form. Martin felt it deep in his soul. You know now. Martin returned to his small, dusty house. The air inside smelled of stale dust, of old oil from his clothes, and of a new, pervasive odor. An ancient, ineffable sadness that finally found a home within him. He sat at his kitchen table, the worn wood cool beneath his fingertips, and pulled out his own diary. It was a simple, lined notebook, its pages still mostly blank. His hands, once knowing only the hard, unyielding certainty of metal, now felt the fragile, ephemeral quality of paper, the delicate balance between permanence and decay. He uncapped his pen, its ink dark and rich against the pale page. He began to write, his hand steady, each word a slow, deliberate act of transcription, a testament to the truth he now carried. "I have seen," he wrote, his pen scratching softly against the paper. How a true shapeshifter lives. He was the last protector of this land, its raw, angry voice. He simply wanted to remain human in a world where men had long ceased to be truly human themselves. They had lost their way, forgotten their connection to the earth, to each other. And now I understand. Humanity, I realize, is not in the form we wear, not in the absence of claws or fur. It is in the choice we make, the terrifying, profound choice we are forced to confront when we stand before the abyss, when we face that which we cannot comprehend, that which challenges the very core of our being. Martin looked up from his diary, his gaze drifting towards the window. In the distance, on the low, dead hill, the silhouette of the beast had dissolved entirely into the deepening shadows, becoming one with the landscape. A timeless guardian once more. The vast, oppressive silence settled over the town again, heavier, more profound than ever. But for Martin, this silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the lingering echo of wild howls, with the rustling whispers of ancient legends, with the undeniable, terrifying knowledge that the world was infinitely wider, immeasurably deeper, and far more terrifying than he had ever, in his most rational moments, dared to imagine. And he, Martin Clay, the mechanic who had sought only peace, was now inextricably, irrevocably a part of it all, forever changed.